An honor to have you here, and also like a big thank you to David Zwirner Gallery for partnering with us for this event. Thank you for coming. Please take seats. There's also like all these bean bags where you can sit, so please make yourself comfortable. And thank you, Oscar, and thank you, Inti.
Well, yes. Because we started a little bit late, I'm just going to briefly introduce, well, the night. As Cosmin said, we're very honored that Oscar made this trip to have this conversation. Some of you in the room might know his work very well. Perhaps some of you, the show now in Hong Kong might be the first exhibition by Oscar that you have seen live, but definitely been showing for very actively in the last 10 years in different spaces, from institutional biennials, major group shows. And I think that how we're going to navigate this talk is through the projects themselves, sometimes chronologically, sometimes they will be linked thematically. It is definitely Oscar, an artist of my generation, and someone who has brought new languages to the current practices of art. I would not give like an introduction. I think it would be more interesting that we start talking about a bit of a trajectory of works that you've put up for this presentation, and then we just create a dialogue. Yeah.
So I know I made a long way, but it's actually a kind of challenge. The flight in itself becomes a kind of the beginning of this endeavor here tonight. So we had a bit of a conversation earlier, and Inti and I, we're both from Colombia. It doesn't really mean anything, but we were really having this conversation about certain works, and I was saying to him, you know, there are certain, particularly this image here, Mercantile novel. The Mercantile novel was my very first project in New York in 2014 with David Zwirner Gallery, and that show was very much. It's still a very complex exhibition. I told Inti, I really don't think that the show has been concluded. I think as time passes, and I have as an artist the ability to create a distance. There are so many unresolved situations with the show that started from a kind of point of view of it being a narrative about my relationship to growing up in Latin America under certain conditions, which then become a bit of a personal narrative. And I think with every show that I think I did more or less from around 2010 to 2014, a lot of these exhibitions have yet to. I saw them as indices, so they were much more about getting information out, and not necessarily giving a full picture to an audience. As I think that a lot of it will come round later in time. And so if we move on to the next slide, so just to give you a little bit more information about the show, Colombina is it's a factory that was founded in the turn of the 20th century in the southwest of Colombia by a very powerful landowning family. Sorry, and I think this is where I struggle because it becomes too narrative. It becomes too personal, and I think at this stage I'm not so sure how interested I am to dive into this kind of personal narratives. But let's maybe have a bit of a go at it. So Colombina, it's owned by this a landowner, effectively. It's a very big family in terms of politics, and also incredibly responsible for communities in this region. And through me navigating the art world, I acquaint myself with this family, not as someone who has grown up in this community, but as someone who's now an artist in the art world. And so I think, Inti, you talked about this kind of how a lot of these relationships become politicized. They become politicized because of how somehow everything becomes or goes full circle. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about that. I mean, I think you explained it really well.
Maybe just something that I'm thinking about as you were speaking is that this was the first show that you did at the gallery, and it was in a moment when there was a lot of support from the practice that you had been doing before the gallery, like with, let's say, a lot of visibility and having this gesture of not bringing actually an object-based practice to the first show. It was kind of like a courageous act to bring like a form of production of a social experience in a gallery to be like your first solo exhibition, which is very different to what you see now at the gallery here in Hong Kong. But what we were talking about this morning is that perhaps it's not so different, because when you see the works at the gallery that you will see for those who are joining a group that is here to see the show after, or if you have seen them already, you can see that in those collages of textile and of print and of process where you stitch again back all the textile that has gone through a bit of like a violent process, and then there's these pieces of black velvet that give you a certain moment of like a peaceful moment, no? Like what happens with velvet as a surface is that the texture of velvet doesn't allow any shine, no? It's like a deep black. So there's something like peaceful in that over juxtaposition of very violent gestures that have gone through different processes. And what is interesting about this project, which you don't really get to see the whole process in this image, is that this small factory that Oscar, sorry?
No, it's quite a big factory.
Yeah, sorry. The big factory that he created.
No, I mean, no, it's a small factory, yeah, it's a small factory.
No. So no. The business of Colombina as an enterprise is huge and multinational, but the small micro version that he did in the gallery created a line of production where there was all this, social engineering being exposed to the viewer. And at the end, the production was this marshmallow covered with chocolate, no? that people could still experience. So this is how somehow we still, when we consume all the time products of globalization, where the palm oil that is used to produce a certain food, well, it comes from very unjust forms of labor and unjust power struggles and social struggles. Yet when we eat that marshmallow, there's something that is this quiet, like a moment of a certain very individual happiness and contempt in a way. So that velvet, somehow we were saying that you could say that this type of work is completely different, and it is, from what Oscar is doing now, but there's still this juxtapositions of what you related to also desire and guilt, and maybe you can talk more of other works or related to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this talk it's becoming a kind of conversation that it's getting into this under the skin, I think, of like what very often is performative rhetoric or performative conversations about art or about aesthetics, and I think we will get there eventually. But I think starting this talk with this project, these images, it awakes a certain kind of almost also resilience, but also kind of rejection. It's like, do I want to go there? I don't know. And these notions of guilt, notions of responsibility begin to kind of come up. To keep kind of talking about this project, it was something that it was. I have the responsibility to do this. It is also at once something that it has been part of my work. This kind of one can say slight antagonistic, kind of maneuver. I also very often do not like to be too explicit about things, because then that to me kills the possibilities of things being open-ended. But the narrative of this project is so clear. I was thinking about New York. I was thinking about and this, thankfully this project happened 4 years ago. We're thinking about migration. We're thinking about labor, oppression, and I think just to kind of link it forward to the show here in Hong Kong, there are these drawings that when I said that getting on a plane, 30 hours ago from Bogota, it doesn't really matter because it becomes a place of work also. So I made work on the plane. So it doesn't. It's not an issue. It actually becomes like the perfect space to think and to make drawings and to think more in a way succinctly about these ideas. And so when I said earlier that these kind of shows, they become an index of sorts. They become pillars that, would I do a show like this again? Very unlikely, simply because they feel like it's one gesture that needed to happen. And so you begin to shed skin, and then you move on and you move forward. and these notions of guilt are precisely because I do enjoy making paintings, and I do want to indulge in the studio, and I have the right to do so. But I think at the same time, I do have the awareness that I come from a certain place, and there are certain, I was on the phone to a radio station in St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States. A couple of days ago, I was in Bogota, and we were on the phone, and we were talking about a project that I did there, and we were talking about social politics, and I just said something like, right now I'm here in Bogota, and everywhere I walk in the city is full of injustice. So, injustice. So, you encounter injustice at every turn. And then you think, what is art going to do? What is art going to do to bring into question notions of injustice? And so I know that that it automatically fails. I know that in a way we can have conversations around. I mean, we can look at this picture and we can pick it apart and really have a go at the social dynamics. But it's all rhetoric, at the end of the day. I think what one does, nevertheless, you create, like I said, platforms and an index of sorts, because that project happened. It was a very successful, yet to be concluded show, and out of that, I've moved forward to create these other kind of diverse bodies of works that we will continue to discuss. And so what you do have is you begin to have a practice that has a robust kind of dimension, but injustice and oppression and anger is still very active and it's still very alive. And that will not end, It will continue. I think it will stay very much alive. And so then that becomes indulgent too, because you have the opportunity and the platform to indulge in setting up a production line in one of the most commercially successful galleries in the world. And that also becomes kind of interesting as a kind of juxtaposition of production and labor and work and so on. So, like I said, there are different dynamics at play, and I think that I will want to continue to have a distance from this show in order to conclude it, because I think it's almost like a good wine. The longer you leave it, the more tasteful it becomes. Yeah, so I mean, this one also, it's part of this kind of narratives, and so this beautiful framed certificate is of my father in 1982, and so in a way, just like tonight. Back in 2012, 13, I meet a collector in Bogota, and through conversation, we realized that her family again own plantations in the southwest of Colombia, and it happens that they used to employ my father when he was in his 20s. and they gave me his work file. And so this was one component of the, I think 56 Venice Biennial in 2015. So there's a kind of continuation from David Zwirner, 2014, 2015. There's all these kind of narratives that kept kind of coming up, and they were things that were in parallel to now a pretty important body of work, which is the work at the Venice Biennial, which began, but no, it began here. It began in Bogota. It's ironic how I have not really been so active in making or having a relationship to Colombia. I mean, I left Colombia in 2000. No, I left Colombia in the mid-90s as a child, and obviously my practice evolved and developed in London. I lived in London through all my education, and but I think condiciones a un particular kind of roughly translates to situations or conditions yet not known. And I think I was as the title suggests, I was kind of ambivalent or kind of uncertain as to what this body of black canvases meant and where it was heading. But I certainly was profoundly interested in being quite generous with myself and putting myself in a kind of on the spot, and I think I still do the same thing. So I guess what I'm referring to is I had no idea what these black canvases symbolized, but I was nevertheless interested in exposing this to the audience.
Can you just tell us more, how are they actually made? Because they depend, I know they vary, but there's a lot of processual, not like yours.
Yeah. Well, these canvases, they are oil on canvas, or more often they're not linen on canvas. Linen is much more robust, and a lot of these works are shown outdoors. So linen, it's linen on canvas. Sorry, linen on oil on linen. And so here in early 2015, I was on the eve of the Venice Biennale, and I think this show, in a way, it kind of cemented a body of work that is ongoing, that maybe started in 2013, 14, and it's still ongoing, and it's effectively the very kind of, it's like meditation, painting 3-4 layers of oil paint and burning them onto, so like they become fossilized. I'm really interested in this idea of fossilization, like burying time, and the process of doing so becomes quite ritualistic, and it was something that I did without any particular conscious, and that it became more about the process. And almost as a like I was in like I'm paying a kind of debt or something, so symbolically, I in my head it's like I am I think about the factory. I think about bodies being kind of the life of these bodies kind of being sucked into or sucked out of them, like quite in a way viscerally, like this factory kind of sucks your life out, and this gesture of painting is almost kind of an act of mourning. I am also aware that it's in that kind of very microscopic, didactic situation. It is important that it resonates, and going to St. Louis in the Midwest of the United States, a project like this feels so true also. Or going to Baku, a kind of the residues of the the Russian, what's it called, the Soviet Union, or when you go to the northern cities of the UK. So to me, this idea of traveling is precisely important, so that all these kind of transnational connections are made, and that these kind of endeavors and gestures are not just simply do not simply stay within a local context, So this was a kind of, in a way, the genesis of something that is still very important, and how I imagine it has so much more to go and evolve into. But these shows, they become these kind of pointers and this kind of, even looking at this image now, that show is just so fossilized in time. It feels kind of old, but something that was very important as a kind of symbolic gesture.
So this was in the show.
Yeah. So now after 2015. So it's been just over 3 years, and I think what I romanticize this show. Like now, it's like, so this is a morgue table.
A what?
Forensic table, and it was. It's not an accident. The moment I decided to bring into the realm of the installation and exhibition, it becomes an intent. So it's it's intentional, but it was something that somehow it was lurking around this university, and literally right towards the end of calling the show complete, I said, we must bring this morgue table, this forensic table, into the exhibition, in a way to really drive home this idea of mourning, and yeah, no, like looking at this now, it's thinking about indulgence, thinking about like I'm paying, like you have to pay your dues, and I think that will continue to be the case. I think I am not free from that. But I think maybe that's just a lot of it has to do with
with the kind of things that maybe I have witnessed, or the kind of situations that I encounter myself in that are beyond and outside the mechanisms of the art world of being an artist.
I mean, I think that what is clear from the images on one hand is that there is an important sensibility of understanding painting and its dimension as installation, that it's, I think, one of the very big strengths of Oscar's work in the past years has brought a language that has all this process that he has described through painting, but when it comes now to putting up in space, like it really creates an installation language where it produces different narratives that are not linear, that they're not direct as, let's say, or literal in the terms of the more social work that we saw at the beginning, but they're, as you just described it, they're charged with all those very visceral forms of finding how a piece of thread that is being repainted, burned, can poetically represent something that is in a state of tension or vulnerability. Just to give you a little bit of context also of the space where it is, because every space also creates different forms of perception. The Museum of Art of the University of Colombia in Bogota is a very beautiful space, but it's a very vulnerable space at the same time. Vulnerable in this, if you think of like it's not a superpower institution that has a yearly budget. Like it really struggles, as the whole university itself and public education in Latin America generally struggles. No, like the idea of the publicness is a very vulnerable site in the context of how capitalist democracies are being developed, and this is the art museum of the university, and it is a space for speaking about ideas of what is the public, or what is the social body, and this very poetic installation definitely translates a state of being, and you feel that in the university, that there is somehow some kind of spirit of things that are under threat, but at the same time, place to think other ways of possibilities. We move to
Yeah.
the one, yeah.
And so here we are, the piece that somehow becomes this kind of symbolic, very performative work in front of the Giardini, the 56th Venice Biennale in 2015. And the piece itself is called Signaling Devices in a Now Bastard Territory. And I mean, I have this kind of, always this desire to be quite descriptive with or be poetic with my titles, and I think here I was alluding to this. We've been talking about mourning, we've been talking about kind of pilgrimage of sorts, but also at the same time, I think it's important to highlight that I am also interested in how this work, or how these black canvases can be also a kind of platform for renewal, you know, in which let's overturn this negative disposition, this kind of negative character, and see it as the end but the beginning of possibility. You know, like we have to suffer, and but therefore let's do it with a kind of helpful, potentials. And I guess this idea of flags or signaling devices, the device that signals, is to say, and also alluding to the number of, there were like 40 flags. I'm also in this idea, this desire for solidarity, desire for it to be universal. So not really thinking unilaterally about like one place, but really saying that we are all in this, and we are all implicit in this kind of in this suffering, and that we all have a negative character and a negative disposition that is just part of us, is almost part of being human, from being a child to all through your life. We have a kind of negative character, that is sometimes it's just well kind of hidden, but it's there.
Now that you mention it as flags and this idea of not thinking it through or going beyond the nationality, also I think it made me think of the context where this was located. As if you, for those who have visited Venice Biennial, when you enter the courtyard and start looking at this Mussolini building of the Italian pavilion, you start seeing all the other national pavilions, and they actually have their flags in front, So there's this very real, outspokenly and loud way of celebrating national cultural heritage. And in this biennial, curated by Okui and Wizard, to enter the national pavilion of Italy, not literally, but the building, and being welcomed by this burned world, it was like a huge gesture for the whole exhibition itself. And maybe it would, am I wrong? Was the photograph, the frame that you showed with the document was also on the wall, right?
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
So it was behind the pillar.
Behind the flags.
Behind the flags, yeah. So that, it was interesting because it was very modest, so people could just pass by, or they could see that there was something else and understood that, this is the father of the artist. So there was also this ambivalence of mourning, of, like, is it related to a very personal story, but clearly it's such a grand gesture that it stayed in between of being a very individual narrative and this macro narrative.
And so moving on, this is in the U.S. This project is called Lucky Dip. It's at the former customs house. I mean, this is another one of those projects that, again, is this very small gesture, and I think a lot of them. If you got to turn your one off. Yeah, it's a very small gesture, but I think these gestures live through images. I think this image more than I think equally as the performance kind of was able to give on the 4 days that we performed this project. So Mighty White is a brand of corn. It's a brand of corn from South Africa, and I started using it in the 2010,
And when I was buying a lot of corn, I still buy a lot of corn to make these sculptures mixed with clay that I just like to have around in the studio. And I cook them and they rot, and I bring them into projects and I show them and I travel with them. So that's kind of another burden, you know? Like to make these things is ugly, and it has no real, it doesn't last, but it's somehow just another way of just having stuff around. You know, another form of being antagonistic, let's say. But then I was very interested in this logo, Mighty White, which you know speaks of. I think it's like self-explanatory, you know, this idea of the mighty, and to have this huge banner in front of the U.S. trade port kind of house that was very active in the 19th century. You know, I mean, I very recently, just to kind of bring things forward, I've been thinking a lot about conversations around, you know, around race, conversations around otherness, and I am not, but I think looking at this image, and obviously it was done in the U.S., it had very, very strong certain connotations there. I mean, you and I, we're not from the state. We are Americans, but we're not from the U.S. And I mean, I don't know what you think, but I have a lot of problems with the rhetoric of race currently. I think it's oppressive. I think it's kind of fascist also to a degree. Because in a way, what it does also, it just shows the power of an imperialist country like the U.S.
To migrate more to this discussion rather than the work itself. You mentioned to me earlier that recently you were asked to participate in a show called Black Abstraction.
Yeah.
Is that right? And that you felt that you participated at the end, but that you kind of felt that, well, the work wasn't on that, or that in a way you understood why was it there, but from, let's say, what we've been discussing so far, and especially this big work that was shown in Venice, the work itself is an introduction to very dark times that we're passing by, and that we have to pass by, as you just said, to try to get somewhere that gives us some hope. But there is a dark moment that we're living, and your work was trying to talk about those violent structural, historical, political processes that there is race there, but it's not only the discussion.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's something that, and it becomes very exciting because it's so clear. No, I mean, it's so clear to me that, I mean, for example, if in the context of race, I mean, here we are in you know, let's say Asia, no, and it's and we were talking about Hong Kong and mainland China, you know, Philippines, Korea, Japan. There are, and obviously I'm simply speculating here because I do not have a very strong historical knowledge, but there are conversations of race around these regions that do not have anything to do with the American rhetoric of race. And when that rhetoric of race becomes so overpowering, this is what I mean. It's an imperialist, fascist kind of oppressive situation that I kind of find frustrating. But I want to, since we're jumping around, and this is something that I've come to, and just to talk a little bit about the show here in Hong Kong. This is my first painting show, and I mean, it is and it isn't, but I've convinced myself, and I said, this is my first painting show. And I guess what I'm referring to make a show that thinks through aesthetics, that thinks through painting, that thinks through gesture and mark making and color and scale. And of course, the iconographies and do have, of course, their own kind of narratives, like writing news in a painting, for example, like rendering, the word news. It's ambivalent, but it somehow brings us back to this moment in a way. And I just want to scan forward to this painting. I want to scan forward to this painting. It's a painting from 2017-18, and the reason why, we've been talking about violence, we've been talking about oppression, we've been talking about all these different things that are so easy to discuss, from a kind of social political point of view. But yet we have a painting show, and one of the most liberating things was to put together these works and to feel like there is a narrative of that in the paintings, that there is all the kind of dynamic shows, the performances, the installations, these works about mourning and nostalgia, and that ultimately all that energy is in me, it's here, it's inside me, and when I make a work like this, which is part of this body of works that is called Catalyst, I feel that all the angst and the anger is there in this painting, perhaps in a much more, I don't want to say interesting way, because I don't want to undermine the importance of all the other work, but in a much more seductive way. That's not to say that the other works are not important. They are indeed, but there is something seductive and something kind of much more curing, much more about this kind of self-indulgence. And so the show here, in Hong Kong, the build-up of content and information becomes my very first kind of understanding of what painting is in my practice and how it has the ability to absorb all my concerns. And so it was a very interesting exercise for me to do. And some people would say, well, why was it Hong Kong? Why did it have to be Hong Kong? And it's, well, you know, it could have been so easy to go into those two gallery floors and had done an installation and do something that it's aggressive of a different kind. But I had to do this for myself and not anybody else. And that becomes more challenging since I've not done it before. So yeah, I thought it was important to kind of slot in the importance of this show for me, and to start to unpick it from, since we've been discussing all these other kind of processes and relationships and dynamics in my work, I wanted to root it back into painting in its kind of diverse existence.
That in such a short time of body of work that you've articulated so well, like those decisions of actually changing, and you've said that it's not that you have forgotten about the work of the Colombina factory, but that it's there clearly, but in some cases you're not interested at all to like look back. Now, even the Venice Biennial is something that you're saying, like, no, I'm going to do, like, I've done this, it might come back, but I'm going to concentrate more in this. And that's for any art student who might be here in the room. I mean, that's something that it's a liberty which should be there for an artist, where you can have these reinventions in your process and not stick to the anxiety of building up one specific aesthetic, no? Or one specific programmatic proposal as an artist. There is, of course, there's not one single way to being an artist, no? There's artists that do cartoons as art throughout all their life, and they're successful and are still funny in what they do. But what's impressive, I think, it's the timing, because it is short. You talk about it like, oh, it's so far, but in terms of practice, it is a very recent contemporary practice that has evolved in a very fascinating way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's also like my character, you know, like it's kind of restless, you know, and it can't stay still, and I'm sure that has its detriments too. Like, you know, will my body be able to take this in, you know, 30 years, like to make a 48-hour trip to Hong Kong? I don't know. but it's you know, it's where things are right now, and I think I'm running with it, you know. Yeah. We should open this up, maybe. Yeah.
We would like to take some questions or any comments, things that you want further clarification as well. Please let us know.
No, you. Oh, yeah. Well, I think it has to be noted that I always paint. You know, I think we talked about these projects in a very linear way. But painting is always parallel. Like, you know, from the beginning, we're talking about indulgence and guilt. But no, painting is always, it's not like I suddenly decided to pick up a canvas and, oh, I'm going to make paintings. I mean, precisely the title of the show has to do with time, you know, like painting always being present and always manifesting itself here and there, but not in this comprehensive way. And I know paint, and I think what the show does, and I think if I'm honest, it gives confidence too. You know, like it's okay, you put this together, and you feel that it's successful, you feel that it worked, and I think this idea of what next is interesting. What it does, it's like, okay, you know, are you going to continue to diversify in all these different strands? Because you've kind of opened yourself up to that. And I think the answer is probably yes. And I think there's been a very strong intensity in the last 5 years of making, of painting, of making these installations, of making these gestures. But I think what is really next is to create space for reflection, perhaps, more importantly, particularly because, as I said, a lot of these projects were seen as an index of sorts. So if I take the show about the factory and the kind of narrative around that, I mean, that is such a complex exhibition to really get your head around. It has such a strong, like, personal narrative. How are you going to really disclose that to a public? You know? So I think that's really what's next, is to maybe begin to close all these different chapters, or to close certain chapters, and maybe the best thing to do is to write a book, or to you know, not necessarily to do another show, but okay, let's really do some research and publish a book. I mean, that show took a year to complete, you know, because all the, you know, going to immigration and so on and so forth, getting visas and buying machinery, you know. But painting is always present. It's always, it goes back to the self. This idea that is about me, and I think that's why I thought, okay, let's just concentrate it back into what is there at the gallery here. And so it becomes very rich ground, because there's all these different things that need to be resolved. Yeah, so for example, so this one, I think you're referring to this one. No, I know, but I'm saying you're referring to this black and white. Yes, that's one. Let me see what else. Just to give context. Okay, well, maybe this one too has a bit of that. But so this black and white, I like to call it in my kind of lexicon a checkered pattern. You know, this kind of, and I mean, there is a kind of narrative behind that, like a informal narrative, but informal narrative. And the formal narrative is that if you, I mean, the picture is very hard to tell from the image, but all these different squares have been sewn together by hand. You know? So there's this very strong texture that is built up, almost like a quilt. And I think when I started making these squares and kind of patterns that are very allude to the history of, we can say, modern painting, like modernism. I wanted to have this around the studio for a while. I think in relation to painting in me, and I'm kind of going in different tandems here because I want to give you a generous answer. So the materials that I use, they have to be very of high quality. So I use expensive linen, expensive cotton duck, and expensive oil paints. And the reason why I mention that is because if I mention the title of the show, the build-up of content and information, it's really that through time, through fossilization and experimentation with making marks, gestures, and getting to a resolved painting, I go through a lot of disrespect. I disrespect material. And one of the first things that I was thinking about was this, like, formalism, like modernism, formalism, and how I could find an entry point into that. So, like, sewing these squares by hand, I mean, you can kind of talk about work, labor, etc., but I want to talk purely about aesthetics and formal concerns. It also becomes in time a platform of sorts, a kind of comfort zone, Like, if you see this painting, the kind of central gesture, that happens is kind of around this pattern, this kind of, so it really is informal. I mean, if you get close to the painting, it's so, and there is another, as you enter the show, there's this big unstretched field of formal, but not so formal, squares. So that's really where that comes from in terms in relation to painting. But also it's just simply an entry point. And other kind of aesthetic concerns take over, like how they collide with another, Inti was talking about velvet, and they become about my own interpretation of beauty, Oh yeah, okay. So in relation to, I think that's here also. Oh, it's not here. Sorry, it's not here. But yeah, in relation to formalism, iconography. I don't know if it was here, but earlier we were talking about traveling. We were talking about this, like, the importance of travel. The local. So having all these ideas, these microscopic ideas of work, labor, in relation to the factory, in relation to corn and trade, and so on and so forth. And the last 5 years I've been traveling extensively, like really like non-stop traveling. And on my travels I just pick up stuff. And one of the very first things that I found so attractive was the iconography on the 100 Hong Kong dollar note. Like this kind of action of this group of people, either were they marching, is a brass band, they were holding flags. There was just so much. There was so much energy in that graphic. No. Also, this idea of iconography, it has a hard time, but it tries to be inclusive in relation to, say, for example, the work at the Venice Biennale, no? The signaling devices in a now vaster territory. It's like making trips to India, making trips to Argentina, going to North Africa, and all the other kind of countries in between. It's really to kind of, through currency, through newspapers, through kind of nationalistic iconographies, to bring them into the language of what it is to resolve a painting. So that's something that I've naturally have done in parallel to a project like Frequencies. With this, Frequencies is a project I started 5 years ago, where I work with different schools around the world. And so it's quite natural. You arrive in Hong Kong and you see this beautiful note. It's like, I want to use that in my work. Yeah. First of all, I didn't say that race was an important thing in my practice. No, I think Frequencies. Frequencies is a project that was conceptualized as an index. It's almost like to me, an index, an archive, to me is something that when you begin to build it up, when you begin to collect a library of sorts, a kind of reference library, no? It's something that will always be relevant somehow. It's something that you will always have an affinity to. Doesn't matter what the times, are. And I think, for example, if you look at an archive of, 45,000 canvases, it's very easy to construct a narrative, whatever narrative you want to construct. Simply because there are so many manifestations, we're talking about, in most cases, individual kids contributing to the surface of a canvas. They sit down at school, the desks, it's kind of layered, it's covered with this membrane, which is a piece of canvas. It stays there for 6 months, and he or she has the ability to download conscious and unconscious information. With that information, talking about news, you construct, you can construct a narrative. So you mentioned race. You can pick a school from, I don't know, a place like Harlem in the U.S. and juxtapose it to, with a school in, Munich. And in that, you already have a kind of, there's so many narratives that are, but geography, different temperaments in how they learn, the daily life of these different kids involved. So you can really construct, So then I think it's an interesting question, and that's why I have a lot of problems with this very didactic, very kind of binary conversations around race, because they don't really become constructive. They obviously create space to have a conversation, but then there is no generosity, because they shut down everything else. So yeah, I'm not interested.
Last question.
I don't have a relationship to journalism. No, I don't. I mean, also formally, I like the word news, like how it sits on the canvas formally. No, it was just like with an oil stick. So NEWS and the dot. I don't. Like, I'm not going to start telling you, oh, it's about this, and no, it's just, I just wrote news.
For people who haven't seen the show, to see it, we're very happy to have the opportunity to see what Oscar calls his first painting show. It is his first, let's say, stretched mounted painting exhibit.
There's a big unstretched painting.
There is one unstretched painting. But do spend time in the show, go very up close to each painting. Every single work is extremely stitched together, repainted. You can see how it's more of an assemblage rather than a painting itself. Every material carries an information, a data, a news. And so this presentation just flattens somehow the work, as all PowerPoints do. I can't take any more questions, sorry.
No.
Yeah?
I'm good. I came.
Yes, all right. Okay, if he's not tired, he's good. Yeah.
Why? Yeah. That's an interesting question. It is true. It is, they're big canvases. It's a challenge, really, to, I think, you know what it is? I think it has nothing to do with scale. It does, of course. And I think another reason why I wanted to make a painting show was because I found the space here in Hong Kong intimate, really, really intimate, in a good way. Of course, the reasons are other, to do with real estate, to do with, the real estate here being expensive, and all these other things. But it felt like it was the space that I could really kind of control and antagonize through painting. And I think in me, beyond scale, beyond boldness, there is a, and this is going to sound very, very masculine, and I hate the fact that it does. But there's a desire to kind of to control and to kind of to really intimidating is not the word, but to really control, to go into a space and dominate it, dominate it, and to have an impact, to give a kind of visceral physical impact. And I think that's why when at the beginning we were talking about the factory, and we were talking about these social concerns, that all these different things that kind of awakes certain kind of emotions, certain narratives. I thought, can I do that through painting? Can I do that through painting alone? And I think that's when I said, well, this is what the challenge is. Can you do it through painting? Can it happen through painting? And I think obviously if I was to do a similar show somewhere else, it might fail because of the scale might be different, and but I think it was very important to make this work, and I think I've become accustomed to make work of this scale, precisely because there is this kind of almost insecurity, wanting to conquer space, to like I want to dominate a space. Thank you.
I think that's a good way of ending. Yes, thank you so much, Oscar. And please, if you have any direct questions or were too shy to ask him, please come closer to him. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.